Welcome to the Peaked podcast, where I talk about gender identity ideology and other bad ideas, women's rights, and free speech from a European point of view. So, Sarah, how are you doing this morning? And can you start by just telling me a little bit about what your job is, please?
Hello, Róisín. I'm glad to be here first. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a mental health professional and I work in Belgium. And I am very regularly confronted to young people suffering from gender dysphoria.
Right, that's interesting. You're regularly confronted by people suffering from gender dysphoria. Are you particularly, is it known that's an area that you're interested in, or why is it that people with that particular problem go to you so often, or is it just that there's so much of it around at the moment?
I think the three reasons are true. I think there's a lot of them at the moment. I'm currently for the last few years. I think they are sent to me because I try to help them by psychiatric assessment and psychotherapy or medication. And it works quite well. So that's why the parents who are not convinced by this trans identity, don't know which word to use, but
Phenomenon.
phenomenon.
Trend.
So trend, yeah. They come to me because in Belgium, there's a conversion therapy ban that is very threatening for mental health professionals. Mental health professionals are really scared to be labeled as transphobic, and they risk 3 years in prison because of if they are considered to be doing conversion therapy. So most professionals send their patient to clinic that transform the bodies of these kids instead of trying to treat them by psychiatric treatment.
Right. And so I spend quite a bit of time in the groups and the fora for people in Belgium who are either suffering from gender problems or identify as trans. And I'm wondering, what is the journey of a mother or father who has a child who's having these kinds of issues and seeks help? Because all I see is affirmation. It's not really okay to be skeptical. Like sometimes you'll see a mother come into the group and say, "Oh, I don't know how to feel about this." And she's quickly told how she's supposed to feel about this. So how would a skeptical parent, am I right in thinking we're talking mostly about kids here because you're a pedo in English sense, but a pedopsychiatric, a child mental health professional. So we're talking mostly about kids here. How does one find their way to you?
Well, that is the problem. They find their way to me by seeing me talking at a conference. These parents are extremely distressed because they see the child wanting to mutilate their body. And usually the child is in a very bad mental state already. So they come to conferences and they hear me talking and they come and see me afterwards, say, "Can I send you my child?" And I usually say yes. And that's how it happens. I also have there's also some websites in Belgium that would help them to be directed to non-trans affirmative professionals.
Right. So, because I hate the randomness of this, I hate the sort of unstructured Wild West of this phenomenon, whereby you might have a child who's having these problems and you type into Google "identité de genre Belgique" and it depends on what page opens up or what results are given to you. So either it's you giving a conference about the dangers of trans affirmation or the reality or the evidence base for transition, or they could end up on meetup group of parents of trans kids, and it could go either way. Like, I absolutely hate that randomness. Do you get the impression that the parents who find their way to you were skeptical from the beginning, or do you think what do you think about who are the types of people who go one direction and who are the types of people who go another direction? Do you have any comment about patterns?
Yeah. I think there are two kinds of parents who come to me. The parents who already know about the subject and feel terrible when they realize their child has been caught. And then you have those parents who are completely ignorant, who think, the LGBT trend is really good. It protects people who are different, blah, blah, blah. So they go online and they find answers. And I would say they make the decision whether they belong to one side or the other. And then they come to me. On the other side, the other parents, the ones who want to affirm their child, most of the time they are either already taken by this ideology or completely ignorant and want to do the right thing. And then they go to transaffirmative treatment.
And so that just scares me because it's a little bit like the schools as well. You never know if, with the Everest situation, which I know that you've talked about in the past as well, which is this very gender identity heavy school, sex education, comprehensive sexuality education, it so heavily leans towards this crazy ideology. And it depends on the teacher you get or the provider you get, how their personal ideological position. And I know also I've heard of parents in Belgium who are very skeptical of trans affirmation and then send their children to the wrong kind of mental health professional who affirms them all the way. And that's kind of the worst thing that can happen, isn't it? Because
these parents are really cheated by the system. There's a website called Cry for Recognition, which is a website for parents who have been caught in that transaffirmative way. And these parents who are ignorant, but they really want to help their kids, so they take them to transaffirmative treatments because it's usually in university hospitals, so they think this is the best treatment. So they go there, and then at the first meeting, they realize that the mental health professional doesn't want to hear the story. They're just there. The parents are just there to be convinced that the child has to be transaffirmed, and they feel extremely frustrated because they never heard. It's not an assessment of the child, social situation, family background, or mental health. It's just a session to convince the parents to let them affirm their child. And it's extremely frustrating.
So we're talking now about mental health professionals, whether they're psychiatrists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, I don't know. These are counselors, social workers, whatever. We're all supposed to be working off the same assumptions or more or less bases that, there were certain rules and certain requirements and certain foundations. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but, how have we gone so astray? How have some practitioners, individual practitioners, who may have had the same training as you and the same starts as you, same parcours as you, how is it that they're ending up on this, having this bizarre, different view?
Yeah, my hypothesis, and it's by taking an overview of psychiatry in Belgium. Psychiatry and child psychiatry in Belgium and in France, for example, because we're really at the same level of, towards this problem. The psychiatry in Belgium is still completely taken by a lot of ideologies, which is like these ideologies are actually beliefs in one sort of, hold on, the word in English, epistemology.
French.
Epistemology. So it's medicine for the last 60, 70 years, has been relying on evidence-based, medicine. So stuff that have been proven scientifically. Everything that is used in medicine now should be proven scientifically. The problem is in Belgium and in France, we still completely blocked first by the anti-psychiatry current. I'm not sure how to say it. Mm-hmm. And this way of thinking of refusing doctors to be psychiatrists have opened the door to a lot of ideologies. That means a lot of professionals will describe themselves as belonging to a theory, but in such a strong way that it's become an ideology and then a cult. Because, if you belong to the psychoanalyst cult, and I'm not rejecting everything about psychoanalysis. I'm saying that theory that is interesting, the concepts are, of psychoanalysis interesting, but they've become like it's become an ideology, and then it's created a cult, which is against other cults like the systemic therapy cults, I would say. And again, I'm not against systemic theory. I am a family and systemic therapist, so to prove you that I'm not against it. But the way it's become, and it's difficult for me to explain in English, I'm sorry. But so old psychiatry is invaded by a lot of ideologies. And ideologies use concepts that are not proven scientifically. So it's an open door to a lot of false and dangerous beliefs. And that's
And
how
in your sorry to interrupt. In your experience, is this unique to Belgium and France, to Francophone world type setup, or is this also in other countries?
I think there's a risk in any countries, but the reason the English people, the British people eventually realized what they were doing is that next to that, ideology about trans-affirmative treatment, you had the doctors that were there with evidence-based medicine, and the psychiatrists in Belgium, in Britain, receive a training that's evidence-based. And so there was a protection that ended up protecting the kids.
Yeah.
Because there's something else. There's some real
I can see that, yeah.
psychiatry. But in Belgium and in France, it's not the case. It's only.
But am I right?
I do. Yeah.
Sorry to keep talking over you. There's a slight delay. Am I right in thinking, though, that in Flanders it's slightly different, because Flanders would be a bit more British in that way? They'd be less prone to ideology and more evidence-based. I mean, that's maybe a racist thing almost to say, but is the problem the same all over Belgium, do you think? Because I think some of the pushback that does come, you're very rare among French-speaking Belgian pushback, my observation would be.
Yes, it's because I've been trained in an English-speaking country, and my framework is completely different. So I assess things in a different way. Like psychiatrists in Belgium think, oh, you do some psychotherapy, and then you have two cults, the individual therapy and then the systemic therapy, family therapy, and then, oh, you give medication. So there's no other kind of assessment. And I think in the Flemish world, I was expecting to have that they would have a more down-to-earth reaction to that. But bizarrely, they haven't. That means psychiatry hasn't grown, hasn't developed as well as I would imagine. For example, so we, the French-speaking, are more into psychotherapy. And then I realized the Flemish were more into medication. And it's proven that the Flemish psychiatrists are prescribing far more medication than we do. So it's not much better, bizarrely. It's not evidence-based psychiatry. The psychiatrists still don't consider themselves as doctors, basically. And there's still, even the Flemish don't have the right framework to assess people.
Right. So this topic is quite new to me, so I might ask very stupid questions. But so you have systemic theory, that's everyone's in a system, sort of, and you have to figure out where you are in the system. Is that sort of more or less?
Yeah, that's the one. That's systemic therapy is extremely useful, especially in child psychiatry, because the child is extremely influenced by his family. So yes.
Right, because when I talk to French friends, they talk about systems. It's all systems. And then there's psychoanalysis, which we've all heard some of the bizarre and wonderful things that have come out of psychoanalysis. But again, it's a useful tool for some things. And then there's drugs, basically. What you're saying, I think, is that ideology and political ideology even has far too much influence on how this kind of medicine is practiced in the Francosphere. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I think because they haven't really understood the process of mental illness. They still seek answers in different ideologies, basically. So it's ideology. It can be political ideologies, because an ideology can take many, many directions, I would say. Many.
Is it related to like French postmodernism ideas that a lot of people talk about?
I think so. But then if you really look, I mean, obviously we are influenced by what happened before. The anti-psychiatry, way dates from the late 60s, Mai 68 and everything. And then it's still there. And so I think it's a descendant of what happened there.
Yeah, because that was all about like who gets to decide that you're mentally ill. Maybe you're just like normal, and it's a power thing, claiming someone for including things like pedophilia. It's a power thing to label somebody in a way that excludes them or stigmatizes them. Okay. So what's interesting then is we have this mismatch, because you have on the one hand, the treatment of this problem is different in different cultures, but the problem is pretty much the same. Like what we see happening in Belgium with young women, especially, is almost copy pasted from the US, from the UK, Australia. It's everywhere. It's exactly the same thing, which shows that it's sort of culturally traveling through social media, whereas the response to it is not, because it's not, we don't conduct we don't construct our ways of working with mental illness through social media. It's through different channels, but the problem itself is definitely social media mediated. So you are getting the same profile of people, I imagine, in your practice as you see everywhere else?
Yeah, I get, very similar profiles. And the first ones I saw were kids who were adolescents, who were fluent in English. So the social media allowed to the contamination much faster than it would have been done without the internet. So a few years ago, all the patients coming with gender dysphoria, they were speaking English fluently. But then now it's in the French social media, so I can have all sorts. But when I help kids getting rid of the gender dysphoria, is amongst everything I put in place is a screen detox, obviously.
Yeah. Because I remember the first time I came across you, that was kind of, at that time, at least a few years ago, was your main thing was screen detox.
Yeah.
Because it causes so many problems. Can you tell me, do you remember which year it was that you encountered your first gender case?
I suspect it was around COVID. That's always a date that you remember. Maybe a bit before or a bit after, but around that date. But after COVID, definitely a lot of them came. But just after COVID, there was no ban on conversion therapy. So lots of professionals allowed themselves to try to help. But now professionals are too scared to be labeled, transphobic, because, the belief is that if you try to get them rid of the gender dysphoria, then that's because you're transphobic. I'm not transphobic because I try to get rid of gender dysphoria in my patients, just like I'm not anorexiphobic when I try to treat a patient with anorexia, just like I'm not depressophobic when I try to treat a patient with depression. So that doesn't make any sense.
I want to come back to how you first realized that there were other people dealing with this issue as well, other professionals. First, I just want to pick up on something you said about depression. I was seeing a psychiatrist a few years ago when I got into this stuff, and I couldn't believe it was happening, etc. And I brought it up with my psychiatrist, and I said, and she's a wonderful person, she's lovely, but she couldn't believe that I would be against it or find it troubling that anyone would affirm a person who believes they are the wrong sex. And she said to me, but when you came to me and said you were depressed, I didn't deny that was real. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, but I hope she tried to help you and get rid of your depression, because that's what we are supposed to do. So, of course, I believe my patients when they say they have gender dysphoria. I completely believe them, but I try to improve the mental health by many ways, and then the gender dysphoria disappears. Of course, that's bizarre to say that,
I think she was thinking on her feet. I think she hadn't been asked the question before, and that was what came out of her mouth. And maybe she went away and talked about it. I just decided never to talk to her about it again. I stopped. I didn't see her. Like, that was a short period a long time ago. But then I actually saw her. I actually noticed that, as you know, we have in Belgium this organization called Trans Kids, and this is the Affirming Parents Club. And I think it has state subsidies as well. And they have this Trans Kids place around the corner from my house in Brussels. And I saw that she had showed up to one of the training courses on affirming kids, because I recognized her dress in one of the photos that they put just on the back of people's heads who were attending. And so I was like, oh my God. So even after that discussion she had with me, she went away and she obviously said to herself, yeah, I need to affirm this idea that's in this person's head.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's the case for many mental health professionals because, as I said earlier, they're not trained properly and they are into some kind of ideology, either one or another. But that means they don't think with a common sense, I would say. I think in medicine, you really have to use a common sense before anything else. But when the theory you're using has become an ideology, and when you yourself belong to a cult, then you can't use your common sense anymore. And then a lot of psychiatrists, first, nobody works the same way, which you could say could be good for patients, but it's too different. There's no common ground. There's no medical ground. A lot of doctors also went to psychiatry to really help people get better. So there's also this position of wanting to save people and wanting to be the nice one, because people who go and see a psychiatrist are usually in distress mentally, and they want to face somebody who is kind and is going to really listen to them. But this listening is going a bit too far, because anyway, so they don't do a proper psychiatric assessment.
Yeah. Is there, like, this might sound like a really stupid question, but is there becoming a sort of a left-wing type of mental health treatment and a right-wing type? Is there what's the conservative approach and what's the left-wing be kind militant approach?
Yeah, I think, but because everything now is split up into, far right, extreme left. And if you say you're more from the right, then there's no right anymore. Anyway, you're far right or you're left, basically.
You're a good person or you're a far right extremist.
Yeah.
There's only two things.
I mean, that's my opinion. I think the left wing is the good politicians and the right wing is the just politicians, the right politicians. They are trying to be just and right and in the middle. So, of course, if the psychiatrist really want to save rather than help his patient, then it will be, linked to the left wing, because, wokeism has got its origin in the left wing, who just wants to really help people and save them from
and give them what they want, I guess. So you go in with distress and you say, I have this fantasy, and they say, we're going to do everything to help that fantasy come true. Is that essentially what they're doing?
Yes, because if you have a savior attitude, you want to give the patient what he wants. If I'm a psychiatrist who does medicine, I want to improve their mental health, which doesn't always go by giving them what they want. And most of the time in life, you help mental health patients by, improving their lifestyle and making them going back to work, because not working is very bad for your mental health. And doing some therapy. And if you want to do some therapy where somebody listens to you and say yes to everything and victimize you because that makes you feel better in the short term, you're not going to get any better. I always say to my patients, when you go and see a psychologist or a psychotherapist, if you feel good when you get out, if you don't feel that you've been asked to get out of your comfort zone, then the person is not a very good psychotherapist. But the tendency now is to want to save people and rather than improve their mental health.
That's so destructive. So let's get back to so we're in Belgium, it's post-COVID, but pre-conversion therapy ban. You'd started to notice that you were getting distressed young people coming in saying, first of all, how did that manifest? Obviously, we want to be very careful about keeping far away from any details of any one in particular. But in general, can you give me a picture of the profile and how did they bring it up? Like, what does someone say when they get into the chair? How did they present it?
The first time I realized there was a problem in Belgium is when a mother phoned me. And you have to know that I never answer my phone for patients, because otherwise I would get overwhelmed. So the mother was so insistent with my secretary that I accepted to talk to her. And she said to me, I need a paper signed by a child psychiatrist to say that my daughter is actually a boy and she can have a name change in her identity card. And I said, I was very not aware of the problem. And I said, I insisted that, as any doctors would say, I said, I need to meet your daughter and I need to talk to her. I need to understand what's happening. And she insisted. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sign anything without seeing the patient. So she hung up on me. And just like that. And I thought, well, that didn't go very well. And that was it. So I realized, so I started to get information. And then patients started to arrive. And it was always the same thing. Kids out of school, spending all their time on screens, on social media, scrolling all day, inversing the night and day cycle. And then living their life through social media, basically. And then they got caught. Or sometimes it was like there was a few of them in a school, and then they get contaminated by a cluster in the school.
And how they presented, the ones that were mostly sucked into it online in their bedrooms and their laptops and their phones versus the ones who were groups of girls in the schoolyard and lunch break, did they present, was there any major difference between those two types of groups, or was it the same sort of?
It was quite similar, but in terms of their mental state, the one was scrolling all day. Their mental state was much more affected. So they had, signs of depression, social anxiety. When the other ones who had met some at school, they were usually still schooled, obviously. They didn't have the social phobia, didn't have the depression. It was like an extreme teenage time, like you go through your teenage years, you go to a little crisis, and the crisis involved, being contaminated by gender dysphoria, because it's a time when you're looking to define yourself and you're trying to find out who you are, and then suddenly somebody tells, and you don't feel good, because we are in an era where teenagers really don't feel good for many reasons, not only internet, but also the parenting style of our time. And then they feel bad, and then they meet a group who is very welcoming and who convince the patient that he or she is in the wrong sex.
And of those two main groups, if we could split them, imagine a split for a moment, are they both as likely as each other to be same-sex attracted or tomboyish, or was there any difference there that you noticed?
Well, yeah. Well, I remember reading the book from the Tavistock clinic, where the professional was saying soon there'll be no gay people in England because, they all become trans. I didn't have that opinion. I would feel is, well, probably it's higher than the general population, but I would say it's 50-50, but not automatically same-sex attracted kids. And anyway,
Right.
I see them, they're quite young, they're 14, 15. It's an age where you can try to have some sexual encounters with same-sex friends, but that doesn't mean you're going to become homosexual for the rest of your life. So it's difficult to say. But yeah.
So that wasn't an overwhelmingly obvious pattern that they were pre-lesbians. Okay, right.
No.
So that's interesting, because I wonder what it says about the social contagion aspect of it. I mean, it's equally spread across.
Yeah. And also, again, I think it's a mistake from professionals to say that people are homosexual at the age of 15, because, at 15, you meet your best friend, it's called homophilia. And then I know that a lot of my patients age 15 around, of course it could be 12 sometimes or 17, but they would say that they have a girlfriend. I mean, girls would say, I have a girlfriend. But if you really go into more details, there's no sex at all. It's just a best friend. But I think it's a bit more cool nowadays to say it's your girlfriend, that there's actually no sex at all, even not, the minimum, I would say. So it's, I wouldn't label a teenager,
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. And in terms of the patients themselves, like, would they say to you, like before your first consultation, would you go into it knowing that they're coming to you for gender issues, or would you sit down with them and then they'd say, how do people generally frame it? Like, because I'm actually finding it difficult to imagine myself or anyone of the age between 12 and 17 and sitting down in front of an adult and saying, I am a boy on the inside. Like, what way do they say it?
Most of the time, I do my psychiatric assessment and I don't talk about that directly. And sometimes I don't talk about it at all. And when I do that, some of them don't even talk about it the first time. They talk about it the second, third time. And then by then, I've already put them on some specific psychotherapy. And the subject sometimes doesn't even come into the conversation because they realize that it's got nothing to do. I mean, it's not really the problem, because when I assess them, I discover a lot of other problems to be dealt with. And some of them will tell me, as soon as they are in the room. But I said, okay, I'm going to do my psychiatrist assessment. I'm going to ask you loads of questions and we'll get back to that. And so it's never really a problem, but I wouldn't start my assessment based on the claim that they are in the wrong body, because they usually come with extremely specific and cliche sentences, sentences they've heard many times on social media or even in the school or whatever, in the dance class or whatever, because the sentences they've heard in real life are the same because, it's from somebody else who was on social media. So it's always the same cliche and always the same sentences that are coming back to it.
Can you give me an example of the type of cliche sentences? Because I'm just,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Born in the wrong body is the most common one.
So they might say, je l'ai ressenti que je suis né dans un mauvais corps. Like that.
Oh, yes. That's it. Just that's un mauvais corps. Yeah.
Wow. It's so weird because in English, I think in English practice, I think patients would know not to come out with that at this point because there's so much activism around. Nobody is born in the wrong body. So that cliche has been écarté now. But yeah, I wonder what they're saying to UK clinicians. That's interesting. Before I continue what happened post-COVID and the conversion therapy ban, I also want to know if a young person was having the same kind of struggles 15 years ago, how would it manifest before the gender era? Because obviously kids, especially girls, go through particular issues. I remember it myself. And how it manifested is I actually don't even remember. Some girls used to cut themselves, maybe still do. I see a lot of adult women now with scars on their arms in meetings, in corporate meetings, and you'll see 45-year-old women with scars all the way up their arms. And they're from years ago and they haven't done it in 20, 30 years. But I know quite a few. But what way did the same struggles that you're finding under the gender label as when you meet these people and you do your assessment, how did they manifest in the past?
I think it's very, very influenced by the culture they're living in. And obviously now with internet, the culture is all, all mixed up and you don't have just one culture different from one another. But first you have to take into account the fact that teenagers the mental state of teenagers is being worse and worse, for the last 25 years. When I was a teenager, it was great to be a teenager. It wasn't a source of distress. You had a little bit of distress by thinking, oh, what are boys going to think about me? But mainly it was all positive. It was an increase of freedom. The hormones made you a bit high. It wasn't a bad stage to go through. So, considering teenagers as difficult years has only been there, it's a belief that's been there for 15, 20 years. But I think really in my time, the point of your teenage years is to try to affirm who you really were. So you were trying to discover, what kind of adults am I going to be? And then some people went through a phase where they were trying things, like you had the punk period, that was my generation. And then you had the goth one. And then, you had many trends that weren't dangerous at all. And I think the trans trend is like one of these, is like the goth before and the punk before. And some were more violent than others. The punk had loads of piercing everywhere. The goth are just people who don't wash themselves. I'm being a this, But, you see what I mean? And of course, it wasn't. And then you had, as you said, the self-harming period that is getting a bit out of fashion now. There's less and less kids self-harming and cutting their arms. So basically, it was very influenced by the culture. But the intensity...
Right, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, because the way I framed the question to you was with the assumption that just being a teenager is terrible. But actually, when I think back to it now, I think the main issues that I had in that period was actually just, oh my God, the whole world is looking at my body right now. And I don't know why. And I wish it would stop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I still need to deal with.
When you're teenagers, there's many characteristics in being a teenager. One of them is taking risks. But obviously, taking risk in my days was, cheating the authority, getting out without being seen. And getting out without being seen was, climbing off the window and spending an hour in the cold with your friends, and then you go back to bed. Nowadays, taking risk is getting a bilateral mastectomy.
Yeah. Oh my God. Oh God, that's awful. We'll get back to the mastectomies in a minute. How did you realize that other people were dealing with the gender distressed patients as well? Like, was it during on the conference circuit, or how did it become a theme?
Well, when you are practicing psychiatry with with an ideology, a specific ideology, for example, let's say individual psychotherapy, well, you can't possibly help the patient because most mental health problems in teenagers have two etiological factors. That means causes. It's a lack of holding environment, boundaries, limits that are set up properly without violence, but are there. And the other reason is the screen exposition, problematic use. So, but if you believe that psychiatry should be, giving individual psychotherapy, you're not going to help a patient by talking to her. I had some patients who've been seeing psychiatrists or psychotherapists, and all they did was talking to them for 45 minutes, an hour. Then they go home and they carry on scrolling for 15 hours. So it's not going to ever make them better. So these people were not helping. So when these people realized they weren't helping and were offered some transformative treatment, they thought, well, that must be the solution, the right way to treat people, because obviously it's got a huge placebo effect. Giving puberty blockers to a child has got a huge placebo effect. So within days, they feel better. And then they feel bad again. Obviously, it doesn't last. And they feel even worse than before because they've got the puberty blockers that have huge effects on their mental and physical health. So very quickly realized that they weren't getting the right psychiatric treatment. And then the transactivists, before the ban, started to expand the contamination all around the society. So well-intentioned psychiatrists started to take notice of the transactivism.
How did you figure that out? Because I remember years ago you telling me about a conference you had attended with one of these individuals from Trans Kids Belgium, and he was talking nonsense and you had to leave or something. I don't remember. But at some point, when did you realize that your field was contaminated with this ideology?
Yeah, that was, I think that conference was a terrible conference. It was really painful to hear. And that was just after COVID. That must have been in 2021, something like that. But I realized that these professions that weren't able to help their kids, the patients, just by talking to them, because that's not what they need, they went to that conference. And then they just thought, oh gosh, that might be the answer, because they don't have any answer. So that's that. And then they get caught by the cult.
Were you aware of the lobbying that was happening or the advocacy that was happening towards envers the Minister for Equalities or for Health, Van Quickenborn, is it? Or all those people who were involved in asking for a conversion therapy ban? Or did you become aware of it when it was too late?
Oh no, I became aware much before, but there was the minister in charge of that ban that was a bit more cautious than the one who applied it and who made it pass. I think the conversion therapy ban was passed when the new minister came in place, and then she wanted to show how good she was, so she passed the ban.
Was that Sarah Schlitz?
So yeah, Sarah Schlitz was the one before, and then the one who passed it was Marie-Colline something, I can't remember her name. And she was so proud to be in charge of the trans people, whatever. I can't remember her title that she made. The ban was ready to be passed, but was never passed. But I was completely aware of that.
And so what percentage, if you had to give a roundabout figure, what percentage of people in your field who knew about this thought it was a problem?
What do you mean, the ban therapy?
Yeah, the therapy ban, the proposed ban. How many people that you spoke to who would be affected by the ban thought that it was a good thing or a bad thing? Like, what was the general feeling?
The general feeling was that it wasn't a good thing. But when at a conference, one of my colleagues wanted to have a list of professionals that were ready to help patients without affirming them, couldn't get a list because people were too scared to give their name as professionals who wouldn't affirm the patients because it was too dangerous. So basically, I haven't met any mental health professionals that thought it was a good thing. Ever.
Wow.
But most professionals don't want to get involved in that discussion because it's so scary.
And this was even before the conversion therapy ban was in effect.
That might have been just after. Actually, that was just after.
So do you think that the fear about talking about this topic is only related to the potential legal repercussions? Or do you think that even before that, there was fear of talking about it for fear of being labeled right wing or whatever?
Oh no, that was present before the ban. The ban made it worse, but there was because a lot of professions want to be seen as nice people. If you do psychotherapy, you want to help people who are suffering, blah blah. And also they were scared. First, they weren't understanding the subject properly because they haven't got the right analysis. But also, yeah, they were a bit, I'll have to say, cowards. And still now, I mean, now more than before, most professionals now know about the transactivism and the mutilation of kids, and they completely agree with me. But believe me, you will never find anybody in Belgium who will speak out, ever.
This is the aspect of this that I want to know about. Like, how can, and this applies to so many fields, how can people just say nothing? I just don't understand. What is it about you that do you think, and like you can flatter yourself all you want, but what is it about you that made you say, no, 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 I will risk my career, whatever, my reputation, because I can't watch this and not say anything? Like, what is it about your psychology? Because you're the best person to ask about this because your job is examining people's motivations and minds.
I think there's probably two reasons. One of them is that my English might be a bit better than most psychiatrists, even though it's not perfect. So I read a lot of what's happening in English literature or media, and a lot of my colleagues can't speak or read in English, so they're very limited to any articles or any publication about the subject, so they don't master it. And then the other reason is that my framework, as I said, my way of analyzing the problem is I acquired it from my English training, and they don't have that training. So they don't have the same way of analyzing. So I think that's the main reason. And also, I couldn't sleep at night if I tried to defend kids from this mutilation because, it's our problem, mental health professionals, to prevent and to alert people about what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Because everyone is looking around for the evidence that this is bad. And the people who are in the best place to produce the evidence that this is bad are people who deal with mental health issues. And if you don't do it, we're really screwed because they're not going to listen to a feminist on Twitter or a politician who's just saying it for votes. But we need data, we need evidence. So yeah, you're right. You are the people that everyone is going to look to. But I've noticed that a lot of the data in French on this topic comes from Swiss universities who seem to be completely captured. Maybe I'm just looking in the wrong places, but whenever I come across a French language, this subject treated in French language often comes out of like universities in Switzerland that seem to be completely nutcases. But I mean, I guess they're all over France as well. All right, so let's talk it specifically then just about how you encountered the conversion therapy ban in the field, if you wouldn't mind telling me that story.
Well, I was aware of the ban when it was passed, obviously. And then, but I carried on seeing kids, obviously, and there were more and more kids when parents found me. The problem with the ban, I encountered a few problems with the ban. One of them was when I started to see a child and I referred her to a psychotherapist because I usually deal with the parents and screen detox, blah, blah. And some individual therapy is done by a psychotherapist. And the psychotherapist received some threatening emails from a university hospital asking her what her intention was by seeing the patient because she wasn't affirming the patient. So the emails were extremely threatening, and I had to help the psychotherapist to reply to that professional from...
Were they activists in what was the link with the university? They were linked in some way to the...
Oh, yeah, they were from a university that affirmed kids, and I think it was a young mental health professional and who probably believed in transactivism and into affirming kids. It was just a young, I would say woke professional that really thought you should affirm patients. So yeah. And then the second thing is I heard about a psychologist having a complaint at the psychology commission because she didn't call the patient with the right gender. because she didn't want to affirm the gender of the patient. And then also the fact that we couldn't possibly make a list of professionals to help children the right way. It's the main consequence of the ban.
So you were trying to establish a list of of traditional exploratory therapists who could deal with these children in a not immediately affirming way, or who were critical. I don't know how to say this even. Just a list of normal mental health professionals, but people wouldn't agree to have their name on it. So that wasn't possible to do that. But in practice, what we have is this sort of informal, people can become aware of the names of non-affirming or normal psychotherapists, mental health professionals, if they just ask in the right places and ask around. So there's like this, there is a sort of a mini industry of good doctors who'll do their due diligence. You just have to ask around to try and find these doctors. It's not obvious.
Yeah, but I think one of the consequences as well is that there are less and less of them because they are too scared. So, if they find that the patient is insisting on affirming them, they started to be scared. And most professionals now are directly, because they don't master the subject, even though they should, because it's their job, they don't master the subject. So for them, it's just like the patient, they don't really care much about the patient. They say, okay, I'll send him to transaffirmative treatment because it's legal in Belgium. That's what they do. They don't really ask themselves the question, is it the right way? And if these professionals are unable to help, then I can understand they feel powerless. There's a ban there that could get them into trouble. And, they have so many demands and, we are so overwhelmed with patients that it's easier, just send them to transaffirmative treatment services, and that's it. They don't look at the problem more in depth.
So tell me about your run-in with the conversion therapy ban.
So I did 2 appearances on the media. So I did an interview on a radio. That's the Catholic radio that's gone now, by the way. So there's always a judgment about the fact that I actually agreed to talk to a Catholic radio, which, Catholics are far right, blah, blah. So, no, that's important because it's very difficult nowadays to say you're Catholic because you're already, labeled other.
Oh, I know all about it. Yeah. And also the TERFs and the gender critical women in Ireland are all writing for the Catholic Herald now. And of course, it's the most fascist thing, whereas everybody was a Catholic until 5 minutes ago in Ireland.
That must be quite interesting there. And then I participated into a debate that was supposed to go online. I guessed before that it was a trap to try to label somebody transphobic and to show the world how trans people were suffering, blah, blah. But the debate went very well and they never managed to label me transphobic according to what I said. On the contrary, actually, I got on really well with the trans person that was there. So based on these 2 interviews, these 2 appearances, 2 complaints were done to the police, one for hate speech and one for conversion therapy. So that was 2 years ago, 2.5. And on the document sent by the police to me, they specified that I could get 3 years in prison. And so I went. The funny thing is, I went to the police to get my deposition. I took my lawyer with me and her assistant. And at the end of my deposition, the police woman asked me, please, are you going to carry on your fight? Which I thought was quite amusing.
Wow.
Because she was supposed to stay very neutral, but she couldn't help it. So and since then I've been waiting for my sentence.
So since then, you've been waiting for what? Who's doing what with your file now?
Now my file is being buried and a lot of file on the desk of the magistrate. So whenever he or she gets to read it, it's going to be classé sans suite.
Yeah, classé sans suite is like discontinued with no charges or whatever.
Yeah, no charges.
How do you say that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or I'm going to go to court.
Is there a possibility that you would end up in court?
Well, since Belgium has been created 200 years ago, there's never been any political prisoner. So I hope we won't. I mean, I can't see myself going to prison for 3 years because I try to help kids not being mutilated. But that could happen. You never know.
But that was the purpose of the law. So when this wonderful Be Kind Minister of Kindness, Everlasting Love and Kindness signed into law, when introduced this conversion therapy ban, the intention was that nobody in the professional health field would ever be able to deny a person's inner sex swap delusion. On pain and punishment. So if your file is being buried under and it's not brought to justice, then what's the point of the law?
Yeah, but that's because the law in Belgium is not functioning very well. As you know, you might have heard on the radio.
It's noted, yeah.
They're not looked after very well. They are overwhelmed and with all sorts of complaints. So I don't think I'm a real threat to society. So I'm not sure I'll be, a very important case to deal with urgently.
Right, but the possibility is still there. If we got a very left-wing government in the future, and the pressure could be put.
Yeah, as my lawyer said, if it's a woke judge who take the file and read it through, then I'm in trouble. If it's a judge with common sense and intelligence, then it will be, without any follow-up.
That's very, very scary. Okay, I have taken an hour of your time. I think I have one last question. And I think about this a lot. And I wonder if you have as well. A therapist who affirms a person who is having very bad struggles is just as and that person is same-sex attracted, and says, yes, I affirm that you are what you say you are in the wrong body. That therapist is, according to my reading of these laws, just as susceptible to being accused of converting on the basis of sexual orientation.
Yep.
Or is this something that you've thought about and talked about?
Well, I wrote an article in which I try to explain that the conversion therapists are actually the ones who affirm the patients, because they're trying to change their sex and their sexual orientation. So they are the ones who affirm the patient. They are the ones who do conversion therapy. But once the professionals and the politicians realize what's happening really, these people are in real trouble, just like they are in Britain at the moment. Apparently, there's more than 1,000 lawsuits about these cases because they are performing a really bad job. And what they do is causing iatrogenic effects, which is negative effect, but they're destroying people's body. Yeah, they're harming the patients. And one day, people will understand. And these people who are just influenced by an ideology are going to be in a lot of trouble. I might be in trouble now, but at least I can sleep at night because I know I'm doing the right thing. And these people are just, obeying an ideology that is very scary. And that's...
So I think that the outcome on the ground is that in reality is that affirming therapists are saying, oh God, actually, I don't want to get in trouble. Even if I gung-ho for this ideology, I see that there's a risk. The other side, people who think like you see there's a risk. There's a very obvious risk that's targeting you in particular, but the other side could be affected by it. And the ultimate outcome is that young people with these problems aren't being seen by anybody. And I think that penny is going to drop. I don't know if you know that idiom. Yeah. The penny's going to drop for everyone on the affirming side that, oh, I don't want to get in trouble. And I just want to compare it with a case in Belgium a few years ago that was also driven largely by ideology and also involved punishing doctors for making the wrong call, according to the judge. So do you know about the case of this girl who calls herself Intersex, and the Reine Astrid Uderf hospital she sued them. She brought them to court because they performed a surgery on her.
Yeah, I heard about it.
And she said that I wasn't properly informed. Now, when you look at the details of the case, the doctors said to her, these are your options. According to her, they told her we can do this or we can do this or we can do this. And they gave her some options. And she feels like she wasn't informed properly, and she feels like she was also pushed to do the surgery. There was pressure put on her to do the surgery, and she won. And I think that case is largely ideological because, first of all, there's no such thing as intersex. But second of all, it was a very woke sort of an a court case that was brought because people were looking for an intersex case to prosecute. Those doctors were punished. Those doctors were found.
I know. Yeah.
And
that's terrible.
That's terrible. But so that just shows that these things are happening. Doctors are being punished for ideological reasons, I think. And I think that case sort of shows that, that case scares me, honestly, because it's possible that the doctors, but I mean, it just shows to what extent the judgment of the doctors are put on trial.
Yes. But then the main problem in that case is that it's the power given to the child. I mean, the doctors did the right thing. They looked at her genetics, and then they looked at the pathology that made her sexual organs not clear. And then they could have suffered from complications. But then she was taken by the ideology and given the power, a power that wasn't supposed to be hers. She basically used that change, that operation, that surgical operation. I want to say to feel important, but how can I say it? Again, the problem in this situation is the feeling, le ressenti. I'm not sure how you say that in English. The ressenti of the patient took over common sense and medical evidence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When she reached teenage years, she felt bad because now teenage kids feel bad because they're not raised properly, and we live in a society that makes them feel bad, basically. That is not a holding environment. And then she was given an authority that she shouldn't have.
Yeah. And I noticed that in that case, it was reported this was very clearly a girl who had an issue with her vagina, a partial vagina missing because of her genetic rare disease that she had. And the RTBF, which is the state broadcaster of Belgium, called her neither a boy nor a girl.
Yeah, exactly. So that means her feelings, her ressenti, takes over everything else. And then another point in that case is that, they punished the doctors because she wasn't able to give an informed consent. That was one of the points. But when they give puberty blockers and when they do mastectomy in mentally ill young people, the problem of the informed consent is not taken into account.
Yeah.
These kids cannot give an informed consent, but that's fine because it's trans-affirmative treatment. So just asking them is enough. But then in that case, just asking them was supposedly not enough, which doesn't make any sense.
It's one of the huge sort of car crashes at the intersectional carrefour is like, the intersex argument that a child can't choose versus the trans argument, which is apparently part of the same collab, the same grouping of ideological campaigners, advocacy groups, is that the child always knows intimately who they are and can choose whatever they want from whatever age. Yeah. It's a big contradiction in there. And I did notice that the Belgian NGO, Genre Pluriel, that supported that girl in that case, they weren't very enthusiastic about her arguments about having been mutilated beyond repair by having a vaginoplasty, because that's actually what they're campaigning for, is vaginoplasties from 16 or, it was a big mess, that one. Anyway, that's what I wanted to just establish there right at the end, that Belgium is completely ideologically captured. Can you tell me what you're going to do in the future? This will come out when you're already left the country. Can I just have your last words on how this situation has affected your decision to leave?
Well, to be fair, it was both. My decisions to leave was basically the way Europe and more specifically Belgium were handled by politicians. It's become a dictature and nobody realizes it. And I'm so in contradiction with all the ideologies that are contaminating our way of thinking that I just find it's just impossible to stay. And also, obviously, for financial reasons, because when I understood that to be financially viable in Belgium, you have to cheat. I don't agree with that. I do not want to have to cheat to have a comfortable financial situation. I've studied enough. My husband have studied enough. We should be allowed to live in a comfortable way without having to cheat. It's not normal.
It's true that Belgium is like at every level is kind of being poisoned by very extremist leftist ideas. And it's unfortunate that you have to escape that. I have to say, I've been thinking about doing the same thing myself. It's a great loss, though, to this country because, so I wonder, are you planning on still keeping an eye on the situation with trans healthcare?
I think I'll be even more comfortable.
Very good.
Of course, I'm going to keep fighting. This is still my country, and I'm still hoping that one day they're going to get a bit more common sense and a bit more intelligence, what to say, the politicians to deal with what.
To roll back, or to confront it or to do something about it. Yeah, it's funny because you're leaving your country, but I'm thinking of going back to my country because I think my country is savable. I don't know that Belgium is really savable because your culture is so fundamentally different in the sense. Well, you see, I'm not Belgian, so I can't tackle the Belgian problem as well as I could tackle the Irish problem because I know how people think over there. So I'm really glad that you're going to continue to try from your new place of residence. So that's awesome. And thank you so much for talking to me. And best of luck on continuation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, cool. We're done.
If you like my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to peat.substack.com and taking out a paid subscription.